Tonight, military spending reaches an all-time high as Russia-Ukraine war changes global geopolitics, with the US and the European countries major contributors of military expenses. And experts warn of future workers' strikes as workers demand higher wages to keep pace with the increasing cost of living. Later in the show, a new podcast explores Canadian terrorism laws and how they deal with suspects who are mentally ill. Stephen Joe from the National Council of Canadian Muslims explains.
Parts of our community are treated. That includes the national security space that we're wading into with this long-form podcast, which I think is really the first kind of investigative long-form podcast that does this.
Assalamu alaikum, good evening. This is Muslim News Canada on Muslim Network TV. I'm Catherine Bullock. The Stockholm International Peace Research Institute says that world military expenditure is at the highest it's ever been, coming in at just over $2 trillion in 2022. The US is the world's biggest military spender. Its military expenditure was 39% of the global total. Most of the rise in military expenditures is due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Europe's military spending had its steepest year-on-year increase in at least 30 years. US military aid to Ukraine in 2022 was the largest amount of military aid given by any country to a single beneficiary in any year since the Cold War, totaling nearly $20 billion. Experts are warning the public to expect labor unrest in the coming months as more workers may be hitting the picket lines to deal with the rising cost of living. The news comes as Canada's largest public sector union strike today entered its 8th day. Last week, nearly 155,000 public workers walked off the job to demand better wages. The strike is affecting many public services, including immigration, citizenship, passport, licensing, and tax services. The union is looking for a pay increase to keep pace with inflation. The government is offering less than that. China's President Xi Jinping has called Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, telling him that China will send a special representative to Ukraine. This is Xi's first phone call to Zelensky since Russia launched a war on Ukraine last year. China's foreign ministry spokeswoman says that Xi told Zelensky that China is ready to develop bilateral ties with Ukraine. Xi believes dialogue and negotiation is the only way to end the war. Xi is sending the Chinese government's special representative on Eurasian affairs to Ukraine and other countries to begin the dialogue. For his part, Zelensky said his phone call with Xi was long and meaningful. The Indian police have arrested a Sikh separatist leader. He has been leading a movement that calls for an independent Sikh homeland in India's northern state of Punjab. On Sunday, police in the northern state of Punjab tweeted that Amritpal Singh was arrested in the town of Moga. He had been on the run for over a month. The independence movement was launched in the late 1970s, triggering a wave of riots and violence. It is named the Khalistan movement. While Sikh secessionism has largely died down in India, pro-Khalistan groups have remained active internationally. The National Council of Canadian Muslims, or NCCM, is launching a new podcast called Concealed. The 5-part show explores national security, terrorism, mental health, and family. It does this by analysing the troubling case of Abdurrahman al-Nasawi, a young Canadian man serving out a 40-year sentence in the United States for planning terrorism. The podcast co-hosts are NCCM's legal director, Saamiyah, and investigative journalist and NCCM content writer, Stephen Joe. Stephen joins us now. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the show.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you so much for having me.
It's our pleasure. NCCM is doing very important work in the civil rights advocacy, and I'm wondering why you are moving into having a podcast.
Well, I think one of the major areas that the Muslim community and community organizations are moving into is to be able to tell our community stories from our perspective, to give our view of things, to give our criticisms of how maybe parts of our community are treated. That includes the national security space that we're wading into with this long form podcast, which I think is really the first kind of investigative long form podcast that does this into the area of national security, and in this case, the story of the Nasawi family.
I do want to ask you about why you chose that story, but just let me dwell on this topic that you mentioned for one moment. The national security area is the area exactly the lens through which Muslims have been viewed since 9/11. Scholars talk about the securitization of Muslims, looking at Muslims only through that lens. Are you saying, or did you say that this is sort of like the first attempt from a Muslim organization to wade into that space ourselves, to tell the narratives ourselves?
Well, I think NCCM and many other Muslim organizations across Canada, of course, the United States, have been in this advocacy area for a long, long time, for the past 20 years. So by no means is this, a kind of a first wading into that. It is, however, I think in Canada, the first among the first efforts to really do this from a narrative story investigations point of view, where we tell the story of our community, of people who belong to our communities, and to talk about from their perspective the effects of national security, of surveillance, of what some people might call the topic or the debate of entrapment, of counterterrorism, radicalization, all these things that have so long really just omitted Muslim voices, whether it be the larger mass media or anywhere else. This is NCCM's attempt at opening the door to discuss these issues from that perspective, the narrative perspective, where we take control of our stories.
There are unfortunately several stories that you could have chosen. So why did you pick the story of Abdurrahman al-Nasawi?
I think there are so many reasons. The story of Abraham al-Nasawi, of his parents who have been advocating for him, of what happened to him. This is a story that really exemplifies the themes of post 9/11 Muslim life or Muslim community challenges that have really not really gone away, despite it not always making the headlines all the time. These counterterrorism measures by the RCMP in this case, and the FBI working with the RCMP to work on this teenager at the time, Abdurrahman al-Nasawi, out of his house in a suburban Ontario setting, really exemplifies and really tells the story of those themes without getting into really heavy sort of academic perspective or jargon or anything like that. And that's what we're really trying to do. But his story captures those themes. This is a boy who found himself on the wrong corners of extremism, internet spaces, and also has a life filled with challenges when it comes to mental illness and addiction. The RCMP, the FBI knew about this. They knew that he was 17 at the time when he found himself in these unfortunate areas of extremism, of ISIS-related areas online, when he was off his medication, when he was struggling with his mental illness and addiction issues. But they basically tied a undercover agent to him to push him to carry out what ended up being various plans to bomb parts of New York City. And they ended up waiting for him to cross the border when he became 18, an adult. During a family vacation, when they got to a New Jersey hotel, the FBI arrested him, and here we are. He is serving 40 years in a maximum security prison in Colorado.
We interviewed his parents actually on the show recently. There might be audience members today who haven't heard of his story, so it was good that you explained it. But you've just mentioned some of the things that I know distress the parents, that there was an informant, so there is that entrapment aspect, and the parents have said, why didn't they tell us? Why didn't they let us know? What kinds of things did the parents tell you when you were interviewing them?
We've spent hours and hours and hours with the Nasawi parents, who've really taken it upon themselves to do a campaign for the past several years to try to bring their son back into Canadian facilities where he doesn't have to suffer the harshness of a maximum security prison in the United States. We tried our best to tell their story, to tell their perspective. Theirs is not the only perspective that we offer in our podcast. It is five parts. It is many perspectives, and we tried to get at the truth of things. There is the narrative from the prosecutions and the National Security Agency side that Abdurrahman, when he was 17, 18, was already deliberately working with ISIS agents and people and terrorists and planners online, and he knew what he was doing. And if you take a look at the court records, hundreds of pages that we have, then you see that they try to paint an almost exaggerated version of that, where Abdurrahman, the teenager, is also a terrorist mastermind. We contrast that with the perspective or the narrative of the parents or the family of Abdurrahman, where they portray him as the victim in this situation, who was entrapped, in their words, by the FBI, by the RCMP. They did not talk to the parents, despite knowing that he was suffering from mental illness issues, addiction issues, and that he was possibly off his medication at the time, and instead basically stuck a undercover agent, a mole basically, onto him when he was unstable, to push him into carrying out further various plans that were already in place to bomb parts of New York City, a plot that obviously never happened because it was never going to happen.
The parents told us in the interview they did with us that he's often in solitary, and he's tried to commit suicide several times. And because he's not a US citizen, he's not being given his medication. Is that also something you learn? And how do you think the Canadian government is responding?
Well, I mean, it is a complicated kind of situation. This case has so many various parts to it that we all try to get at. That's why it is a 5-part series. The treatment that he has gotten, or that he has Abdurrahman has raised as a young adult, as a young man in his 20s, early 20s, in various American facilities, prisons, and now at the Colorado Maximum Security Prison, is very, very alarming. The fact that there's rampant Islamophobia against him by guards who physically abuse him, who chain him up, who mess with his food, and so on and so forth. He's not an American citizen. He's not entitled under that system to various services such as mental health services, medication, and so on. They're not, as far as the parents are concerned, very responsive when the parents do voice that their son needs these services. And so one dynamic we unearthed was that because of these lack of services, lack of attention to Abdurrahman's needs, he ends up off his meds, off his regime of services and medications that he needs.
I'm afraid I have to cut you there. I'm really sorry, we're out of time. Yeah. But keep an eye out, people, for the NCCM Twitter feed when they announce this podcast called Concealed. And thanks, Stephen, for joining us today.
All right, no problem. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. We need your support for donations. Please scan the QR code or go to our website, muslimnetworktv, to make a donation so that we can continue to amplify the voices of Muslims in Canada and abroad.